open government in Canada. We got to hear a little bit about open government here in the United States and some of the challenges, maybe some of the ways parts of it have stalled. What's the state of open government north of the border?
So I think there's kind of a range of things that are going on. There's at the municipal level, so with cities, there's a fair amount of excitement. So you have cities like Vancouver and Edmonton that I think are really charging forward. New cities that are looking at open data and open government. So Ottawa is now exploring, and I think is getting ready to launch a portal. The city of London, Ontario, similarly. There's a movement starting in Montreal amongst French Canadians really thinking about what does open data mean for them, and they would like to see something happen. So kind of a certain amount of excitement in a number of cities. Although I think if you looked at all of the cities in Canada, just like in the United States, I'm sure there's also a lot of cities where the CTO or the CIO or the head of the IT department has no idea what open data is, has no idea what kind of open government and what's going on in Canada, what's going on in the United States. So I think there's still a lot of work to do on that front. At that kind of provincial level, which is like our states, there's a number of provinces that are starting to think about what open government, what open data means, and I think they're kind of in the kind of research and what does this mean for us phase. And at the federal level, I think it's very early. There we have a government that I think has, from a communications perspective, been very controlling, but it is also looking around and seeing what's going on in the United States and Great Britain and saying, well, maybe we need to be at least thinking about what that means for us. So I think we will see some movement shortly.
So does Gov2O mean the same thing in Canada as people are taking it to mean here?
Yeah, we don't have the United States is just so much bigger. And so we don't really have a Silicon Valley. I mean, we have some very dynamic kind of centers of excellence around software in Vancouver, Montreal, and in Toronto, but we don't have the same kind of groupings that you have here. And so there is a private kind of a private society, citizen society kind of drive for the kind of rethinking government, but it doesn't have the same concentration there. So it resonates, but I don't think it resonates quite as broadly as it does here. Within the public service, I think things are more interesting, and Canada's really prided itself on having a forward-looking IT infrastructure. So Accenture for a long time rated Canada as one of the most e-enabled governments in the world. I think for 7 of the first 8 years, Canada ranked first. But I think that's maybe produced a certain complacency, or at least gotten those IT people focused on a very certain view of what IT means in government. And so now I think there's a big, the people like me and the activists are really trying to get people to rethink what IT means for government. And so I think it's really beginning just to take off now.
So when I discuss open government in this context, it almost always comes as a subset of Gov2O in terms of a broader umbrella term. And not everyone always agrees with that framing, but usually think of open government, which is some of these broader transparency, openness, collaboration style issues, the things that the Open Government Directive come out of the White House here talks about. E-government, some of the more traditional initiatives where you've got services of all kinds, some of which have become much more robust, may take advantage of next generation architectures, whether it's cloud or RESTful services, APIs, et cetera. And then this concept of we government, which is to say how you actually look at the people talking amongst themselves and doing things. And that's usually expressed by framing it in terms of this upswell in social media use. What's been the trend in Canada and the attitude towards that particular aspect of Gov2O?
So on the we government part, it's very fits and starts. There's not a lot of governments that have an overarching idea about what it means to be using social media or to be engaging with the public. At the federal level, again, there's a huge amount of wanting to control the message, and so what you get is nothing overarching. You get a couple of public servants here or there who are really curious about this and want to do something and do some really interesting and amazing work. I've seen some very cool projects on Facebook, answering questions, having citizens answer each other's questions, having government participating there. There's a lot of politicians who are on Twitter, but in the actual public service and government, using those types of tools is still very, very new. What I think is, on the e-government side, Canada traditionally has kind of worked hard. But what I think is interesting on looking at the issues around the cloud, this is something that doesn't come up in the United States, but in Canada, there is a huge amount of nervousness among some governments about embracing the cloud because of the Patriot Act. Many providers say, well, if you're going to use the cloud, you've got to be using servers that are going to be based in the United States, and all of a sudden those servers fall under the jurisdiction of the United States and the Patriot Act. That means government information that could be subject to it. And a lot of governments are saying, you know what, we're not actually comfortable with that. And so my big fear right now is conversations about the cloud and government aren't really happening in Canada because of that kind of stop. And as a result, I worry the conversation is going to proceed much more quickly here, and we're just going to lag further and further behind.
So one thing I've found when I've talked to state CIOs is actually the same reticence, but for different reasons. They're interested in setting up clouds within their own data centers. And you can see that happen at the federal level too, when there's this great interest in NASA Nebula, which is open source cloud that they can run on their own servers, which means they don't have to create an agreement with Google or Amazon or Salesforce or anyone else. Now, those cloud providers are making inroads, right? But the same concern is about really entrusting citizens' data, which has often a great deal of privacy issues around it, somewhere else. Now that's true in terms of the privacy concerns from your own commissioner. And I believe Stoddart is still in office there, and she's pushed Facebook quite a bit.
Yeah.
Where does the privacy debate rest in terms of this space in the Gov 2.0 world up there?
The Privacy Commissioner, I think, has been quite aggressive with Facebook, and I think there's a number of Canadians who are grateful for that. One of the things very few people know is that there's a huge number of Canadians who are on Facebook. My understanding is that at one point, the penetration of Facebook in Toronto was the highest in the world. There's an incredible number of Torontonians are on Facebook, and Canadians in general. So for us, I think the issue is kind of front and center. And we're grateful for that, but I don't know that there's a huge. If there were strong privacy concerns, you wouldn't see Canadians on Facebook. I do see a number of Canadians kind of moderating their use and thinking carefully about it, but I don't see it as kind of an overarching issue at the moment.
Okay. And then that actually goes to the good question of data, whether it's social data, whether it's open government data, whether it's data that's being mined from people's activities elsewhere. This is something you've actually written about a great deal in your blog. What are the risks and rewards of open data for governments?
So the risks, I think, are better known. Here we have risks around privacy and risks around security. The security ones, I think, often get overblown. The privacy ones, I think, are real. We have to be very, very careful about whatever data we release, making sure we never release personal identifiable data. What I think is less understood in Canada are the enormous opportunities around open data. There isn't the same culture of disclosure in Canada that I think there is in the United States. And there's a lot of people who I think that would be interesting for them to hear. People think of the United States, they think of George Bush, and like the last, previous administration being quite controlling. But in the United States, at the very heart of your government, the sovereignty lies with the people. And like your ballot initiatives always strike me as incredible, that you guys can have a vote and the next day that vote becomes law. In Canada, the only people who can create law is Parliament. So Canadians can have a referendum, but it doesn't become law the next day.
Well, that's a state-by-state issue.
But still, that like a very immediate, like the citizens own what government does. And it's reflected also at the federal level in the use of public domain. So when a federal government publishes a document, it's public domain. Anybody can use it. Anybody can reuse it. In Canada, sovereignty lies with the Queen, and then through her in Parliament. And our documents have a Crown copyright applied to them, which means they can be used, but only for certain purposes. So there isn't the same culture of a disclosure and of a sense of whatever the government produces, I actually, as a citizen, own. So I think we've been kind of going through a process where a growing number of Canadians are really saying, like, you know what, a public good is something I do own. And the data the government collects is something that I should own and that I should have access to, in the same way I have access to a road or in the same way I have access to this other service. So that's been, I think, that's kind of been growing in Canada. So a little bit of a different culture on that front.
That's interesting. Australia has been making a number of strides recently, and it's always tempered. There are other issues with Australia's government in terms of the internet that keep cropping up in terms of thinking of three strikes or issues like that. But with respect to Gov 2.0 and some of the initiatives they've had around really working with the people, crowdsourcing, digitization of their library, for instance.
Yes.
It's very interesting to see that. The detail here that I found interesting still is the release of their budget under Creative Commons.
Yeah.
It was like a blink up here. So what?
Right.
Of course, you release a budget, what's the big deal? But I guess that was the perspective. It's a Commonwealth country, therefore it was a Crown document, and there were restrictions. Once you release it under Creative Commons, a lot of those restrictions go away.
Right, whereas in the United States, that would just be public domain, and there would be it's automatically in the public.
So how soon until they flip the bid up there in Canada?
I actually, sadly, I think, this is one area where I really worry. I have a certain degree of Gov 2.0 summit envy. I come down here and, I see challenge.gov where, that's kind of that WeGov approach. We're going to go out there, we're going to ask for people for help, we're going to solicit their ideas. I see us years away at the moment from doing anything like that, especially at the federal level. Maybe a number of municipalities are kind of in that space or starting to move in that space, even around kind of things like open data, around sharing of information, even just the policy infrastructure of do we charge for data, what's the governance look like, how do we get all these different silos to work together to release data on a common portal. And a lot of governments haven't even begun to look at that problem. So the huge fear I have is that Canada's kind of lagging behind, and I think there are business opportunities that come with open data, there are empowerment opportunities that come from marginalized communities that come with open data and open government, and that as a result we're falling behind on all those things as well. Well,
I look forward to hearing more from you today when you speak at the summit. And I know I'll keep reading your blog. Where can people find that?
At eaves.ca. That's eaves.ca.
Fantastic. Great talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me.